He noticed the pattern before anyone else did, not because it was obvious.
Vous avez
It
déjà
wasn't.
sauté sur des mines?
On paper, everything
Ouais.
looked clean, briefings aligned, coordination channels stable, operational timelines confirmed across coalition command. The Western Baghdad operation scheduled for that week had passed every formal review. But the man from Task Force Black didn't trust paper. He trusted timing. And timing was off by minutes that shouldn't have mattered, but did. 3 separate briefings, 3 separate sources. Same operational plan, same support architecture, same coordination flow between coalition command and Iraqi security elements. Yet one detail kept repeating: a delay. Not in execution, but in transmission. Orders reaching one specific coordination node slightly later than the rest. Not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to create a gap between intent and action. Most analysts would ignore it. SAS didn't. By midday, Task Force Black was already inside Baghdad. No formal deployment change, no visible escalation. They never moved like a conventional unit. Civilian vehicles, staggered positioning, mixed movement profiles. Nothing that looked military unless you already knew where to look. The city was fully active, traffic heavy, checkpoints functioning, markets open. That was what made everything harder. In chaos, anomalies are obvious. In normality, they disappear. The target wasn't an enemy yet. It was a man inside the system. A liaison officer operating between coalition command and local security forces. Experienced, trusted, embedded across multiple planning cycles. The kind of figure nobody questioned because his work appeared to make everything function smoothly. But over the past week, something had shifted. One convoy route had been altered through official channels. Another timing window adjusted. A third coordination sequence rerouted through secondary infrastructure without clear justification. None of it blocked operations. All of it increased exposure risk slightly. Individually, nothing. Together, something else. Patterned influence. Task Force Black didn't escalate. They observed. He moved through Baghdad like he belonged to it completely. Secure facilities, coalition compounds, civilian districts. No irregular behavior in isolation. Meetings were short, movements predictable, security standard. But in sequence, his day formed rhythm. Same corridors, same pauses before entry into secure zones. Same hesitation at transitional points. Never long, never noticeable unless you were looking for it. He wasn't acting suspiciously, he was checking something. By mid-afternoon, the first operational friction appeared. A coalition convoy reported a last-minute route adjustment. The change came through official liaison channels. Approved, logged, executed. But the origin point traced back to his office. The new route increased exposure. Not dramatically, just enough to shift risk curves upward. No one flagged it immediately, except Task Force Black. Because they knew something most staff officers didn't internalize: mistakes are random. Directional bias is not. Now it was no longer a single anomaly. It was a system test. They didn't confront him. They followed. 2 surveillance elements maintained distance inside the urban flow. Tracking in Baghdad is never clean. Vehicles change, crowds interfere, routes break. But human rhythm doesn't disappear. It adapts. And he was consistent. Too consistent. He moved through identical corridors of the city, repeating timing patterns with minimal deviation. Always entering secure areas after brief external pauses, as if confirming something before each decision point. That was the first real indicator. Not deception, verification. of something outside official channels. By late afternoon, Task Force Black adjusted priority. This was no longer about convoy risk. It was about influence inside the planning structure itself. Influence doesn't announce itself. It hides inside trust. At 1640, he entered a coalition coordination facility for a scheduled meeting. Standard security posture. No elevation, no lockdown. Routine operational environment. Outside, Task Force Black tightened observation. Multiple layers, vehicle-based overwatch, pedestrian positioning, static points covering exits. No visible militarization, everything blended into civilian rhythm. Inside the building, the meeting began. And within minutes, timing broke again. But this time it wasn't delay. It was direction. A revised instruction was issued mid-session. A procedural adjustment to the same Western Baghdad operation. Subtle, technical, presented as optimization. The kind of change that would normally pass without resistance. But it contradicted earlier alignment. Not slightly, structurally. Task Force Black flagged it immediately. Not as interference yet, but as control divergence. Someone was shaping operational flow inside active planning cycles. The liaison remained inside the building. No movement, no visible stress, no deviation in posture when observed through external movement windows. But inside the system, something had shifted. Because now there were competing instructions. And competing instructions in live operations don't coexist. They collide later. Outside, the surveillance team held position. No rush, no escalation. Because if this was compromise, it wouldn't resolve quickly. It would surface at the next transition point. And transition points always come after meetings. Time slowed into controlled observation, traffic moved, civilians passed, routine continued. But inside Task Force Black's assessment, the environment had changed. Not visibly, structurally. And for the first time that day, they stopped looking at what was happening and started looking at what was being decided. The meeting ended without incident. That was what made it dangerous. No alarms, no confrontation, no visible tension when the liaison officer left the coalition facility. He walked out the same way he walked in. Controlled pace, neutral posture, no sign that anything inside had changed. But Task Force Black didn't need visible change anymore. They were watching structure, not behavior. And the structure had shifted. Two instructions now existed inside the same operational chain for the Western Baghdad movement. Both authorized, both logged, both technically valid, but they contradicted each other in timing and routing logic. That kind of conflict doesn't stay abstract for long. It becomes real the moment units begin executing it. Outside, the liaison entered a vehicle and moved east through the city. No deviation, no urgency. Normal flow, traffic heavy, sunlight still high, streets active. Baghdad in daylight always looked stable until something broke it. Task Force Black followed at distance. No compression of movement, no attempt to close. Just continuity. Two surveillance elements rotating through urban layers, maintaining visual without locking onto a single path. The city was dense enough to hide them, structured enough to lose them if they rushed. But they didn't rush. Because the problem wasn't the man anymore. It was the effect he was having. At 1710, the first confirmation arrived. A coalition convoy unit adjusted its staging position based on the newer instruction set. Not fully deployed yet, still in preparation phase, but already reacting to revised routing data. The original plan was still active in parallel. Two versions of the same operation existed inside the system at once. That should not have been possible. One would override the other. Instead, both were being executed downstream. Task Force Black didn't interpret it immediately as sabotage. The first assumption was error propagation. Bad transmission, duplicated authority, procedural failure. That was the safe explanation. But safe explanations don't hold under repetition. Within 20 minutes, a second element reacted to the alternate instruction set. Different unit, different coordination line, same contradiction. Now the divergence wasn't theoretical, it was operational. Two parallel execution paths forming inside a live environment, and both were headed toward the same geographic window. Western Baghdad, same sector, same time window. Different assumptions about routing, security posture, and entry coordination. If both executed as planned, they would intersect in unpredictable ways. That was when Task Force Black stopped treating it as administrative confusion. They started treating it as structural compromise. The liaison was still moving through the city. Second location now, a civilian-adjacent district with intermittent security presence. He stopped briefly, exited the vehicle alone, entered a small administrative building. No escort. No visible urgency. Inside Task Force Black adjusted surveillance geometry. One element maintained vehicle track. Another repositioned forward to anticipate exit routes. A third shifted to environmental observation, pattern recognition across surrounding movement. Still no overt hostility, but pressure was increasing, because now the system itself was reacting incorrectly to its own inputs. At 1742, a third update propagated through coalition channels. This one reinforced the conflicting instruction set instead of correcting it. Official authentication verified, signed, distributed. That was the moment the assessment changed. Not error, not miscommunication. Influence. Something inside the authorization chain was actively shaping outcomes, and it was still inside the system. The liaison exited the building at 1755, same behavior, same cadence. But now everything around him was subtly different. Not visibly, structurally. He got into the vehicle and began moving south. Task Force Black followed. No escalation, no interception, not yet. Because if this was control, it still needed exposure. And exposure only happens when the system continues to run long enough to reveal its shape. At 1810, coalition units began staging under conflicting directives. Not full deployment, but movement initiation. Vehicles positioning, personnel loading, communications active. Two incompatible plans beginning to manifest in the same physical space. That's where risk spikes, not in planning. In execution overlap. Task Force Black reported in. No drama, no urgency in tone. Just confirmation, dual path execution confirmed, source node still active, influence vector uncontained. They were no longer watching one man, they were watching a system misfire, and systems that misfire in real time don't stay stable for long. They collapse or they explode. The liaison's vehicle stopped again, this time in a transitional zone between districts. Light civilian presence, mixed commercial structures, no clear security pattern. He remained inside for several minutes. Inside Task Force Black, the question shifted. Not what is he doing, but what is he aligning? Because the timing of his stops now matched activation points in the conflicting instruction chain. Every pause corresponded loosely to a downstream adjustment in coalition movement. Not exact, but close enough to matter. At 1827, the first partial confirmation emerged. One of the convoy units reported confusion over final routing confirmation. Not refusal, not cancellation, confusion. Two valid orders, no clarity on priority. That's how systems fail in reality, not violently, ambiguously. Task Force Black didn't move yet. They were still inside observation constraint. The liaison was still outside controlled access. No legal trigger for intervention had been formally reached, but that window was closing. Fast. Because ambiguity in live operations doesn't remain static. It resolves itself under pressure, and resolution usually comes too late. The vehicle began moving again, this time toward the western sector. Same direction as both conflicting operational plans. Now convergence was no longer theoretical, it was approaching physical overlap. Task Force Black tightened observation for the first time since morning. Not aggressive, just readiness. Because if this continued, they would have to step from observation into interruption. And interruption meant exposure. Exposure meant consequences. But the system was already moving without them. And that was the real problem. By 1840, coalition staging units were within minutes of activation. Two contradictory frameworks, same geography, same time window, no resolved hierarchy. And the liaison was still inside the flow of it. Not outside it, inside it, and still not clearly defined as either cause or participant. That uncertainty was the most dangerous part, because once identification becomes delayed, intervention becomes reactive, and reactive is always late. Task Force Black finally adjusted posture. Not action, just readiness. Because whatever came next would no longer be about observation. It would be about stopping a decision already in motion. They stopped treating it like analysis the moment the first convoy rolled. Not fully deployed yet, but already in motion. Engines running, crews inside vehicles, waiting for final confirmation that never arrived cleanly. Two instruction streams were still active in parallel, but now they were no longer abstract. They were physical. Steel, fuel, personnel, time. And time was now executing two versions of the same operation simultaneously. Task Force Black did not escalate immediately. They couldn't. No formal authorization for direct interference inside coalition movement had been granted. Nothing overtly hostile had occurred. No enemy action, no breach of perimeter, no external trigger. Just internal contradiction inside a live system. But contradiction in motion never stays abstract. It resolves itself in one of two ways: correction or collision. Neither is clean. The liaison was still inside the system flow, moving west through Baghdad after a short stop at a secondary facility. Same cadence, same posture, no visible deviation. That was the problem. If he was the source, there should have been noise, stress, hesitation, unpredictability. There was none, which meant either he wasn't aware of the distortion or he was operating through it without visible leakage. At 1905, convoy elements began leaving staging positions under conflicting routing authority. One group followed original corridor planning. Another followed revised instructions issued earlier through liaison channels. They were now physically diverging toward overlapping space in western Baghdad. Task Force Black tracked both streams simultaneously, two operational truths inside one system. That's where accidents become events. Surveillance tightened, not by closing distance, but by compressing focus. Multiple observation points synchronized on the same moving elements. vehicle overwatch, pedestrian shadowing, static positioning. The liaison's movement remained central because his timing consistently aligned with downstream shifts. Every major change had temporal correlation with his pauses, not direct causation, but alignment. At 1918, first friction appeared. One convoy unit halted unexpectedly, requesting routing clarification. Radio traffic increased slightly, not panic, but uncertainty. Two valid instruction sets were still circulating, neither overridden. That was the threshold where systems begin to fail, not loudly, structurally. The liaison continued west, no deviation, no urgency. He stopped briefly at a junction, exited vehicle alone, entered a small structure, returned minutes later. No visible change, but downstream the system shifted again. At 1926, a second convoy element reported partial synchronization failure. One segment under original instruction set, another under revised routing. Both valid. Both incompatible in physical space. Now two execution frameworks were converging inside the same geographic envelope. Task Force Black adjusted posture internally. This was no longer about a single corrupted instruction. It was system integrity under dual authority stress. At 1933, surveillance confirmed increasing correlation density around liaison movement. Not direct control signals, none existed, but repeated temporal overlap between his pauses and routing adjustments. The system was not being commanded, it was being influenced through timing. At 1940, containment authority was requested. Not intervention, containment. Because uncontrolled, this would not remain theoretical. It would become physical collision between coalition elements. Response came delayed, not denied. Delayed, because higher command was now seeing identical contradiction across feeds. Two valid orders, both authenticated, both producing incompatible movement. Uncertainty entered the system, and uncertainty creates vacuum. Inside that vacuum, movement continued. The liaison stopped again near a transitional corridor, commercial edge, mixed traffic, low security profile. Task Force Black tightened surveillance geometry. One element maintained vehicle track, another advanced to cover exit angles, a third monitored environmental flow. At 1948, a third procedural update reinforced the revised instruction set instead of correcting it. Now both streams were formally validated. That was the breaking point. At 1955, first convoy element entered convergence zone. Movement slow, cautious, awaiting confirmation that never stabilized. Radio traffic increased. Confusion overtook coordination. No unit could define priority. Both instructions remained active. The liaison resumed movement west, same direction as convergence zone. Correlation became physical. Task Force Black shifted from observation to readiness. Not intervention yet, but full positioning. Because whatever followed would no longer be analysis. It would be interruption. At 2002, convoy streams were within minutes of intersection. Two incompatible systems approaching same space under conflicting authority logic. The liaison slowed again, final stop before convergence corridor. Brief exit, short entry into structure, return. When he came out, convoy systems were already in final approach phase. Containment threshold was crossed. Task Force Black moved, not as assault, as interruption layer. Two elements closed separately, maintaining civilian flow until final contact window. No weapons displayed, no visible escalation. The goal was separation of influence from execution. The liaison was intercepted between movement phases. Immediate physical control applied. No public disruption. He did not resist. That was unexpected. No panic, no escalation, just compliance. Within seconds, he was removed from system continuity. And in that moment, downstream coordination began to fail. Not collapse, disconnection. Convoy elements inside convergence zone lost synchronization. Two instruction streams still active, but no shared reference point. Radio traffic attempted correction, but without alignment, both degraded into uncertainty. Units hesitated, and hesitation creates space. Task Force Black maintained containment. Within minutes, convoy behavior stabilized back toward original instruction hierarchy once conflict in influence was removed. No collision occurred, no inter-unit engagement, just aborted convergence. The system corrected itself because distortion had been isolated before physical overlap completed. Extraction followed laterally, away from main corridors. No external escalation, no visibility spike. Status unresolved pending assessment. But operational effect was confirmed. Timing corruption inside a live system had been removed. By evening, both convoy streams were realigned under unified instruction. Western Baghdad operation proceeded delayed but intact. Inside reporting, conclusion was simple. It was not sabotage. It was structural timing distortion. And once removed, the system did not break. It corrected. But only after coming within minutes of failure in full view. They didn't know if he was guilty. That was the problem. By the time the liaison was isolated, the system had already corrected itself. Convoy elements stabilized, conflicting instructions stopped propagating, and the Western Baghdad operation resumed under a single command structure. On paper, everything had resolved. But Task Force Black didn't work on paper, they worked on cause. The liaison sat restrained, not formally processed, not declared hostile, not cleared. No immediate answers, no device on him that explained anything, no messages, no direct evidence, no signal confirming intent. Just absence, and sometimes absence is the most dangerous indicator. They didn't move him into a formal system immediately. That would trigger reporting chains, oversight, visibility, and visibility inside coalition structure meant losing control of the situation. So they held him off-grid. Temporary location, minimal personnel, no digital footprint beyond internal acknowledgement. For now, he still existed inside the system as active, and that mattered. Because if this wasn't isolated, something else might react. Interrogation didn't start as interrogation, it started as observation. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't defensive, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanation. His behavior remained consistent with earlier, controlled, neutral, stable. That was either discipline or nothing at all. They didn't push. They rebuilt the timeline. Every movement, every pause, every alignment between his position and downstream instruction shifts. No assumptions, just correlation. By early nightfall, the first inconsistency appeared. Not in what he had done, but in what he hadn't. One of his stops earlier in the day, a 5-minute gap, had no recorded interaction in coalition systems. No log, no communication, no reason. That gap hadn't mattered before. Now it did. They replayed it against movement data, timing shifts, instruction delays. The window aligned with the first distortion in transmission. They brought it to him. No accusation, no pressure. Just a question. He answered immediately. Routine check, nothing significant, administrative. Clean answer. Too clean, because it matched expectation perfectly. They didn't react. They changed approach. Instead of asking what he did, they asked what he saw. Small shift, different outcome. He hesitated, not long, less than a second, but enough. That was the first break. Not a confession, not even a contradiction, just delay where there had been none. They let the silence sit. Silence forces adjustment. He didn't fill it, which meant he was controlling output. That alone moved him out of neutral, but still not into confirmed threat. Higher command had started asking questions. The convoy disruption had been logged. The coordination gap noticed. Time was closing. Formal process was coming, and formal process would remove control. Task Force Black needed a decision, not confirmation, because waiting for proof in real time usually means reacting too late. They ran final checks, communications, routing chains, authorization paths. Nothing forged, nothing externally inserted. Every instruction passed legitimate systems. That was the key detail. The system hadn't been broken, it had been used, and the liaison was the only consistent point of alignment between distortions. Not proof of intent, but proof of position. That was enough. They changed approach again. Direct now. They showed him sequence, movement, timing, alignment, not asking if he did it, but showing what had happened around him. People react differently to structure than pressure. He didn't deny it, didn't confirm it, but he stopped answering. That was the second break. Because silence at that stage isn't neutral, it's selection. They didn't escalate physically, they didn't need to. They had crossed the boundary where it stops being about truth and becomes about risk. And risk had already shown itself. 2 convoys, same space, conflicting authority. That was enough. The decision wasn't about what he had done, it was about what could happen if he remained in place. So they removed him. Not publicly, not formally, not as an arrest. Quiet reassignment through internal channels that wouldn't trigger investigation. No accusation, no escalation, just removal from position. Because sometimes the safest action isn't exposure, it's absence. By the next day, he no longer held coordination authority. No announcement, no explanation, just gone from the process. The system continued, and that was the point. Task Force Black didn't prove he was a threat. They proved he was a risk inside a sensitive structure. And in that environment, risk is enough. The Western Baghdad operation completed later that week without incident. No overlap, no contradiction, no disruption, everything aligned. On paper, nothing had happened. Inside Task Force Black, it was recorded differently, not as a success, but as a near failure prevented without confirmation. Those are the operations that don't get clean reports. No captured enemy, no firefight, no narrative. Just a system that almost broke, and didn't. The liaison's status remained unresolved. No confirmed link to external actors, no clear intent. Just timing, pattern and alignment with a moment that nearly caused internal collapse. Some called it coincidence under pressure. Others didn't. Task Force Black didn't decide which. They don't operate in certainty. They operate in thresholds. And that day, the threshold had been crossed. So they acted. Quietly, without proof, without recognition, without anyone outside a small circle ever knowing how close the system came to failing itself in daylight. That was the operation. Not a strike, not a battle. A decision made inside uncertainty, and executed before uncertainty became consequence.